Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you see the complexity of things, it's impossible to go back to that monocultural way of thinking. Complex systems, whether it's an ecological system or a societal system, they don't actually behave as simple as we make them out to be. Learning plants isn't about botany. It isn't about impressing somebody on a hike, but it's about training your perception, about training your attunement. It's about becoming the leader that you are. Just give me 30 seconds of your time. First off, a huge thank you for listening, because you tuning into the show week after week means the world to me. And it's proof that this dream that started way back when I was just a boy in Possum Hollow is bigger than I ever could have imagined. And secondly, we're just getting started. So if you enjoy what we do here, please join the 20% of listeners that listen to this show regularly and follow us on this app. So here's the promise I'm going to make to you. I'm going to do everything I can to make this show as good as it possibly can, even better, now and into the future. I'm going to deliver the guests that you want to listen to. I'm going to continue telling stories and compilations about hunting, fishing, rivers, mountains, and all of the other things that you enjoy about this show. Listen, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for listening to this show, because without you, none of the things that we're doing at Walker School of the Wild would be possible. Thank you. Welcome back to the Wild Life, everybody. My name is Ned Weidner, and today I'm taking the mic on a solo episode because I want to talk about the relationship between leadership and plants. I know that may seem ridiculous at first, but the more time I spend teaching people how to ID plants and some of the medicinal uses that they have, the more I'm convinced that's the same skill that's required to read a landscape is the same skill that's required to become a good leader. And right now, I think we're facing a crisis of that skill. It's a crisis of perception, a crisis of attunement, and the ability to understand relationships between things. Let me tell you, or let me begin with a story. Last summer, I led a series of hikes in the Eastern Sierra of California, partly to promote my outdoor school, partly to get some exercise, largely because I just love being in the mountains, and also partly to make a few friends, I thought. Every hike, we'd go somewhere in the alpine, somewhere in the mountains, perhaps sometimes with an alpine meadow. It was often in midsummer, and the snowpack had largely melted, still damp. There were small creeks that braided through some of these alpine meadows, lupins and wildflowers, sages and sedges, beautiful scenery, right? Almost every group reacted the same way. People would look up, they point at the mountains, right? They talk about the huge ponderosa pines, the snow-capped peaks, the coals and the arêtes and the ridge lines. But almost nobody talked about what was underneath their feet. The rabbit brush, the buckwheat, the lupin, the sage. To most of the people that came on those hikes, the entire meadow, it was just green, just that green stuff, right? One big mass of vegetation that on the way to the viewpoint, on the way to the thing that we were going to do. Botanists actually have a name for this. We talked about it in one of my previous episodes, my friend Nick Jensen. It's called plant blindness. Plant blindness is the tendency to see plants, wood, trees as this indistinguishable background. Right? When we move through landscapes, we often see it as like the vegetation as this blur. A meadow becomes green stuff. A forest becomes woods. And places like a desert become an empty wasteland. When we see the world in this way, right, as this big blur of green stuff, something very important disappears. It's complexity. Take alpine meadows, for example, right? They're not just beautiful places, although they are. I mean, the lupins in alpine meadow with a creek running through it is one of the most beautiful things that I have ever seen. It's one of my favorite places on earth. But beyond their beauty, they also have very real ecological importance, right? Um, they're part of the reason, meadows at least, meadows are part of the reason why California still has water in late summer. You see, an alpine meadow functions as a natural reservoir. When the snow melts in the spring, the meadows, they slow the water down. Right? Dense root systems hold the moisture in place. The ponderosa pines, the aspen, the lupin, the sage, they all play their part. And then the soil spreads all that water out into the ecosystem. And then slowly, throughout the summer, throughout the spring, the summer, the fall, that ecosystem releases the water. Long after the snow meadow has disappeared, the meadow, it still functions as feeding the streams downstream of it, right? But this system of holding the water back with healthy roots, it only works because of diversity. It only works because there's ponderosa pines and lodgepole pines and lupin and sage and sedges. It only works because there's mosses and forbs and fungi and soil microbes. It's this complexity all braided together in this system that allows this to work. And each species, they play a role in holding this water back and stabilizing the soil and regulating the flow. And the problem is when we reduce all that complexity into just green stuff, we're misunderstanding the meadow. We're not even seeing the meadow. We're misunderstanding how these complex systems work, right? And there's something similar that happens in human systems. Philosophers sometimes call this, people like Zizek or some Lacanians, they might call this this collapse of perception ideology, right? And ideology works by oversimplifying complex systems into stories that feel obvious. Good versus evil, right versus left. One cause for every problem. Oversimplifications. There's a simple solution, right? We see this ideology in everyday life, everywhere, all the time. We aren't always cognizant of it, but we see it, we feel it, and we are complicit in it as well. But here's the reality. The complex systems, whether it's an ecological system or a societal system, they don't actually behave as simple as we make them out to be, right? And the problem is that when perception collapses, when we oversimplify and we have these oversimplified narratives to explain complex systems, we don't see these complex systems. They become part of the blur, part of that green stuff, part of plant blindness, right? Or in this way, we might say like societal blindness. And leadership, it's partly about navigating these complex systems, organizations, communities, ecosystems, families, I mean, even fear, right? And good leaders understand the relationships between individuals and some of these complex systems. Bad leaders, they can flatten it into simple stories. I'm not going to name names, but there's a lot of our leaders. Well, I hesitate to call them leaders. There's a lot of people in the American political system that are very good at flattening complex stories, complex systems into simple narratives. Why? Because it makes sense. It makes sense to us. There's heroes and there's villains, there's problems and there's enemies, and then there's quick fixes. But meadows, societal complex system meadows, they don't behave that simply. Right? This is why we call them complex. This is why we call them systems. And what I've learned from taking people on hikes and teaching people about plants is that learning plants can be a powerful way of training our perception, of training our attunement for complexity, for relationships. Because when you start learning plants this really cool thing happens. You begin noticing differences. You begin noticing leaf shapes, and flower colors, the difference between a gill and a stem. You begin feeling the plants and notice the velvety touch or the papery touch or the leathery touch, right? We begin to see the differences in slight different color variations in green instead of just this mass of green stuff. And you begin to see why certain species grow where others don't, and why they do, why they grow there, and why those others don't. You start beginning to see the relationships between soil, water, and insects, elevation and wind and sunlight. When you start learning the plants, this a landscape, it becomes alive. It doesn't become background noise, but it becomes this intricate web of complex relationships between species, right? And what sometimes, or what before, looked like this smooth green carpet, it becomes a diverse community. And that skill, right? We're talking about leadership skills. That skill in seeing the relationships rather than just this mass object, it's one of the most important skills, one of the most important leadership skills that there are. And ecologists have a word for systems that lose diversity. They call it monocultures. In agriculture, monocultures are fragile. They're brittle. They spread diseases quickly. The soil degrades, right? There is no resilience built into the system. I mean, anyone who has driven across Ohio or Kansas or Nebraska, has seen these vast monocultures of agriculture, because in the United States, we love them. Corn, soybean, wheat, cotton, right? But diverse ecosystems, they have resilience. They have buffer shocks, right? And monocultures, they amplify this stuff, right? They amplify the lack of resilience. They amplify the oversimplification. And the same thing, the parallel that is drawn between monocultures and organizations and societies and the ways that we think about them, right? Especially as leaders, especially as people who are teaching about these things. Leaders who flatten complexity into simple narratives. We see this all the time in our political system. We see it all the time on social media with influencers. They often create monocultures of thought, monocultural thinking. There's echo chambers. We can stop there. There's echo chambers. There's fragile ecosystems. And these structures, be they ecological, agricultural, or thought structures, they collapse under stress, right? And some of this, I don't want to jump to too far of a conclusion and oversimplify my own argument here. But some of this oversimplification and this collapse under stress, we're seeing the results of this in our society right now, with societal collapse, with division, so-called division. I think that a lot of that is oversimplified as well. Quite frankly, I think it's much more nuanced and much more complicated than that. But good leaders understand the relationships between all the species, between interspecies dependencies, and they understand that interspecies dependency and resiliency is built on interspecies dependency, right? And just like in ecosystems, I see this shift happening on these hikes at the beginning of the walk. The meadow, it looks like this flat carpet of green, right? Like I said, they're pointing at the mountain peaks, they're pointing at the coves, they're pointing at the ridgelines, and they just say it looks beautiful. But once we start to slow down, and once we start to learn the plant IDs, and we learn what these plants might have been used for traditionally, still can be used for traditionally, and we learn the relationships between this plant and the plant growing next to it, and the relationship between the plants and the river or the creek, something begins to change, right? people crouch down a little bit lower. I've talked about on this podcast before, but one of the coolest things that I get to experience when I take people out in the woods is that moment where they turn from domestic creature to animal, to wild animal in the woods. And that moment happens when they crouch down. It's just like just a couple inches. And inevitably, they start getting curious. Animals are curious creatures. It's part of the animal nature. And they start asking questions. And they notice little insects, ladybugs on the flowers. They might notice a bee sleeping in the cup of a flower. They see how water moves through the soil and braids. And it isn't just, you know, river or creek and bank, but that there is a conversation between the water and the bank and the soil. And when they do this, the meadow breaks apart into hundreds, if not millions, of different relationships. And it becomes complex. It becomes resilient. And it becomes a different way of seeing the world. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you see the complexity of things, it's impossible to go back to that monocultural way of thinking. And this is the lesson that I want to leave you with today, is that learning plants isn't about botany. It isn't about impressing somebody on a hike, although I know some of you will do that, and that's cool too. But it's about training your perception, about training your attunement. It's about becoming the leader that you are. Because perception and attunement, they are some of the core foundations of strong leadership. Leaders need to be able to make clear judgments. If we don't understand the complexity of the systems within which we are working, we can't make clear decisions. We can't have good judgment. So good judgment begins with seeing the system clearly. It begins with identifying the plants. It begins by identifying the relationships and understanding them. Because seeing relationships and seeing and complexity and understanding nuance and the subtle differences between causes and effects and symptoms. This is the job of the leader, right? And the problem, when we talk about the crisis of leadership in this country, the problem isn't really a crisis of leadership. Leadership is really disappearing. What's disappearing is perception, is attunement, is our ability to see nuance, is our ability to see the relationships between things. Because social media, AI, television, all the things, we're training people to move fast, simplify quickly, and react instant. But when you move slowly through a meadow, you learn a different skill, right? You learn slow observation and careful attention. You learn to listen to your body. You learn to see the relationships between things. So the cure for plant blindness and this lack of leadership that we have in this country is actually quite simple. One way is to learn the plants, right? Because when you begin to see a meadow clearly, when you begin to break it apart by its pieces, by its sedges and its lupin and its buckwheat and its fungi and the moving water through the soil, you begin to recover a skill of attention, a skill of attunement. And those skills, they're the root of good judgment, the kind of judgment that successful hunters develop, that good trackers develop, and eventually good leaders develop as well. With the fear of oversimplifying this very complex argument that I'm making, I'm going to try to simplify this as much as I possibly can. Bad leaders operate ideologically, meaning they operate through simple narratives and oversimplification of complex issues. Good leaders operate ecologically and relationally. Listen, if this idea resonated with you, you can find essays like this on my Substack. Plus, I do a lot of plant ID videos on TikTok and IG these days. But if you want to experience it directly, come join us for a field program for a primal hunt because you learn not only how to hunt, but you learn how to ID plants. You learn the relationships with things. So come join us for a program over at Walker School of the Wild because sometimes the best way to learn leadership and relationships is simply to start learning the names of the plants beneath your feet. If this conversation stirred something in you and you want to learn how to make better decisions and be a leader in your own life, then I urge you to check out our upcoming Primal Hunt this October, where you'll not only learn how to hunt bear in the Eastern Sierra of California, but you will be challenged to make better decisions and learn how to step into a leadership role in your own life. To learn about that offering and all the other offerings at Walker School in the Wild and ways where you can connect with yourself and the land, check us out at www.stepintoyourwild or on all the socials at Step Into Your Wild. Remember, stay curious, stay connected, and stay wild.